Hello, welcome back, and thank you for deciding to join this next breakout, introducing a playbook for the successful adoption of Microsoft Teams. In this session, you're going to hear from no less than 4 of SHI's experts in collaboration and end-user solutions. Now, as with all our key sessions, we will leave time at the end for Q&A, so please do use that functionality on your On24 window if you'd like to submit a question for the team to address. And of course, we do ask that you complete one of those very short surveys before you leave at the end of the session. Now, as someone who's myself come to rely more heavily on Teams than ever before over the last 3 months, I'm certainly very interested to hear what the guys have to share with us today. So with that said, gentlemen, it is over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today for this session. So during today's session, we're going to talk to you about how SHI leverages our Microsoft Teams deployment methodology to ensure that our customers maximize their Microsoft Teams investment. Joining me on today's call, I have John Winters and Peter Bean, who are going to talk to us about adoption and change management and how implementing a successful adoption and change management process will ensure the overall success of your Microsoft Teams deployment. They're going to be followed by Rob Iarkis, who's going to talk to us about how deploying a Microsoft Teams training plan as part of your overall strategy for deploying Microsoft Teams is going to help increase adoption for your end users, whether it be the systems administrators that now have to administer this new environment or the end users who will actually be using that environment, making sure that they're all comfortable with the capabilities of Microsoft Teams or getting full use out of that solution. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by asking you, why does an organization deploy Microsoft Teams? Well, from my perspective, it really comes down to one simple component of the equation, and that's the employee and the employee experience. Organizations are working very diligently to figure out ways to better increase employee engagement and increase employee productivity, and finally increase employee retention. Because what they've found is an employee that's not as engaged is not going to be as productive as an employee that was better engaged within the organization. That employee that's not engaged and is not productive is going to have a lower level of job satisfaction, which oftentimes leads to job churn. They become a former employee, which has been estimated at a $1 trillion with a T, problem within the United States alone for organizations to address. So organizations are looking for creative ways to make sure that the employee experience is such that they do feel engaged and they do feel productive as an employee. They're doing that by creating a flexible work environment for their employees. No longer is it acceptable to just put an employee off into a cubicle somewhere and tie them to a desktop computer. Nowadays, employees come to work expecting the ability to be more mobile in their environment. They want to be able to work from that airport, that hotel, that coffee shop, or in today's world with COVID-19 pandemic going on, the ability to work from your home office, whether that be a dining room table, a spare bedroom, or for people that are more likely like myself, an actual dedicated office space at home that you can use. They're no longer willing to accept the rigors of needing to go into an office, especially with COVID-19. And they want the devices that will support them in that mobile effort going forward. So organizations are looking for solutions that give their end users that productivity that they're looking for in a more mobile environment. Everything from the physical end user device they're using. So for example, a Microsoft Surface Pro device that an end user can now use to access the data and applications they need to from wherever they are, whether it be at work or in a non-traditional location. They're also looking for solutions that help people be more productive when it comes to team meetings, especially now that we're dealing with a geographically dispersed workforce, whether it be in their home office, in the same state or the same city, or across the globe. So we need to make sure that we're using solutions that better allow people to do that. Things like the Microsoft Surface Hub, which is an all-in-one smart whiteboard that allows a user to share ideas and concepts with users, whether they be local in the meeting space with them or whether they be through a solution like Microsoft Teams, remote in another location. But they're all seeing the same things. You're able to write on that whiteboard together and work together as one unit, even though you're not all physically in one location. So that gets to the third concept that we're seeing, is that customers are looking to implement a unified communication and collaboration platform such as Microsoft Teams to ensure that those employees are being as productive as possible when it comes to communicating and collaborating with one another. So I'd mentioned the employee experience and engaging that employee. We really put the employee at the start of what we are doing here when we talk to organizations about deploying Microsoft Teams. For us, the most important thing you can do to be successful with your Microsoft Teams deployment is ensure that you understand your end user requirements. Different end users are going to have different requirements from their Microsoft Teams environment. If I'm a manager of a team, I may be looking at Teams as the solution that helps me better communicate with my team during my bi-weekly meetings, either just through an audio conference call or maybe a video call or even doing a screen share for that. If I'm somebody in the HR department, I may be looking for better ways to communicate company-wide documents such as an employee handbook or a vacation schedule that's coming up for an organization. So being able to use capabilities within Teams to publish that out for those end users to use. Or maybe I'm somebody in the marketing department that's looking to do some type of a webinar for a large audience of prospective customers or even customers. Being able to do that through things like Teams live meeting capabilities, so they can broadcast to thousands of end users at one time as part of what they're trying to get out across there. Or maybe I'm just an employee that's trying to collaborate with a coworker that, again, is in the same office or maybe is across the world from me. How do I do that? How do I share documents with one another across the distance that we now see? You can no longer just look over a cubicle wall to get answers from somebody or collaborate with somebody or share ideas with somebody. You need to be able to have the tools in place to allow you to do that, and that's what Microsoft Teams brings to the table. So I'd mentioned we oftentimes start with the end user and what that end user experience is going to be. And you'll see here on our methodology, that's exactly where we started. So we feel it's most important to lay the foundation for your team's deployment by focusing on the strategy and design work that you're going to do up front to make sure that when you deploy this solution, it's actually meeting the needs of your end users who will actually be using that solution. So everything from understanding what the users need to understanding what security and compliance requirements you may have as an organization that are going to need to be adopted within the Teams environment to ensure you're meeting the compliance standards, whether they be HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, or any number of other standards that are out there. So the next phase is kind of that build and migrate phase. That's the phase that all of us within IT feel very comfortable working with, and that's what we're used to doing when we deploy technology. It works great if you're deploying a server or a storage array. When you start talking about solutions that affect the end user and how they do business, you really need to need to put the customer first or the end user first and focus on that design and strategy. You also need to look at what are you going to do long term to make sure this solution is not only going to meet your needs today, but in the future by adopting some type of a governance model for that and ensuring that you've executed an adoption and change management solution as part of what you're doing here. And then finally, make sure you're training both the end users as well as the system administration team on how to use the tool going forward. So with that, it's now time for audience participation. If you could take just a second here and respond to this question. How are you in your deployment of Teams right now? Where are you at? Are you just starting that process? Maybe you're already in the design phase and you've already completed a strategy for that. Or maybe you've already moved on to the build and migrate, hopefully with doing that design and strategy up front. Or finally, maybe you've done all that and you're actually all the way through to training those end users and making sure that adoption and change management's in place to make sure everybody is using that. So let's go ahead and look and see how those results are coming in. Hopefully you guys are awake. Oh, wow, that's incredible. So it looks like the majority of people are actually in the deploy and optimize phase, with the second highest number being the strategy and design phase. So that's really good that you're that far along the process. I'd be interested in hearing more from you individually later on how that phase is going. Because like I said, what we tend to see is that people get stuck at that build and migrate phase because that's where they feel comfortable as an organization. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John, who's going to talk a little bit more about adoption and change management and how that can help you move from that design or the deploy and optimize phase into actually useful production of the solution. John, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just as Mike discussed, once you identify your organizational requirements in your team's deployment, a critical next step is adoption and change management. And in a word, the key to success in this part of the process is communication. The most important piece of that communication is really to think of your end users, your internal customers, those stakeholders within your organization who are going to benefit from the deployment of Teams. And really the best way to start is to think of yourself in their shoes, to really take a what's in it for me, putting yourself in the position of those stakeholders and thinking very critically about what those people care about, what they want to hear about this process, what benefits they'll receive, and craft your adoption and change management process around those needs. And then the next step is to get the message out. That part of communications, I think we immediately jump to. But first, once you identify the position you're going to take and the benefits that you're going to communicate, then you want to figure out exactly how to push that communication out to your stakeholders and the people you identify within the organization that really matter. Initially, a lot of us, including myself, you might think, well, I'll send a mass email. That'll take care of it. It's a quick way to get everybody's attention. I can send that easily. They expect to see that type of communication. But unfortunately, a lot of times in these periods of dramatic change, when you're rolling out something entirely new to a group of people, that type of communication is easy to ignore or sometimes downplay in its importance. People see that message, or they may not even see that message, but they may receive it and put it off. So engagement events are really the recommended way of accelerating the way that we get the message out. In this time of COVID and working at home, a video session similar to what we're doing now may be a better choice. It's a live medium. It does take people out of the day-to-day of reading emails. If you're going back to the office, you could do something creative like a booth in a conference room or cafeteria. Just be creative in how you get the message out. Don't just rely on the standard modes of communication that you use for all the other parts of your business. Start to think of other ways to get people's attention and really emphasize on the what's in it for me mentality that your stakeholders are going to take naturally. So I want to turn it over at this point to Peter Bean, who will talk to us about some use case scenarios. Peter?
Thanks, John. When we look at adopting Teams, it's a big job, right? And there's a lot happening in real time. It's really important to prioritize what you do first based on the impact it can have on your business, while also understanding the implementation effort around people and processes to execute. Every touch point you create into Teams drives overall Teams adoption. So finding the things that you can do that have a low impact on the IT deployment side, but big impact and create many value-add touch points for your end users, that's the best place to start. Digging into today's focus, chat, meet, call, and collaborate, we try to focus in on what we've learned in the field working with our customers about what use cases can make the biggest impact in driving adoption. This chart is how we see the real world today. But it's also important to understand how this has changed. Before the pandemic, what was once transformational is now a quick win. What used to be a quick win is really now a first success. If we were on a webinar 4 months ago, we would be looking at a fundamentally different chart here. The reality we see now is that many users have gone through 2 years plus worth of adoption and change management in normal times in the last 3 months. Right now, first successes that are super low impact but drive big reward are file sharing and sharing files. An easy file sharing workflow driven by Teams makes users' lives a lot easier and is very simple to deploy. And same with quick and easy distribution of content. These things are simple, they bring touch points into Teams, and they create familiarity for our end users. The communications workflows in the upper left are the ones making a major impact right now. They've all moved from business transformation to a quick win in the last couple of months. And that's because people have changed and they're honestly more willing to use them right now. But it's not just the people and their willingness that's changed. It's also the ease of deployment that's changed for these collaboration stacks. And changed for the better. In October of 2019, these communication workflows were much more difficult than they are today in June 2020. But they still have the same transformative effect on your people. This is why we see so many people making this shift in their customer base. If your users are making calls, hosting meetings, using video within Teams primarily, the adoption of the rest of Teams will accelerate dramatically. It just comes down to touch points. Things like town halls in the transformation area and executive communications, still a little harder, but bring huge pull-through with business impact and visibility. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that one if you haven't already. Using any device from anywhere to get access to what you need is also very important to your success. I used to work on the road in offices, cafes, planes, trains, and automobiles. And when I switched from a traditional laptop to my mobile-ready Surface Pro X, using all the integrated workflows into Teams, my life kind of changed. It was probably the most transformational moment in how I work since my first video conference 17, 18 years ago. I look at how productive I am now, right, versus how productive I was before, and it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. My productivity doesn't change whether I'm in an airport, on a plane, or sitting at my desk. Now, I'd like to get an idea where all of you are in the Teams journey right now, and which ones of these things you've done before. So there's quite a few people on this webinar. You can vote for as many of these as you want. Just do me a favor and vote up all of these things that you've already done in your environment. I have an idea which ones are going to come up at the top, right? File sharing is a big one. Meetings and video over the pandemic is also a big one. Calling, not so much, but I'm generally curious to see how far some of you have gone in this space. It's also telling because, you know, the top 2 or 3 answers that we get here, if you're not doing those things, you should be asking yourself that question. Why am I not adopting these workflows that so many others have? I'm going to go ahead and push the results out now. I think we've waited long enough. Let's see here. So, wow, video conferencing, everybody using it. That's spectacular. Basic file sharing, 92% of you. 50% or so of you are on the calling train already, which is absolutely fantastic. And virtual meetings is another big player. Now, this is very much what we see in the real world, but I want to just quickly ask you now, same ones, what do you think you're going to do next, right? Based on what you've learned about your people in the last few months, what are the next things on your list of to-do items that you think are going to make the biggest impact in your business? Again, please vote for as many as you can, or as many as make a difference, and we'll take a quick review of that. Oh, did I push that too quickly? I might have. Let's see here. I think I might have pushed it too quickly for all of you. So if I did that, I apologize. Let's move on. Understanding it's super important to prioritize not just the workflows that you work on, but also the people that you work with. John, tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. As we've been talking about this adoption and change management process, once you've identified the stakeholders in your organization, some of the use case scenarios, and really the targets for what you will be rolling out in terms of your communication, it's really helpful to then identify the specific types of stakeholders and group them accordingly. And the first group you should focus on are really those people within the organization who will benefit directly, that their day-to-day will be drastically improved by the work that you're doing to implement Teams. These folks are your critical core persona, the people that you need to reach out directly and immediately. So in the example here on the slide, we've got people like sales, customer service, finance, IT. And once you have those people identified, you can more easily craft your communication to target them specifically and really reach their needs and communicate in a way that they feel is meaningful. The second audience that you should identify are really the people who are going to drive change. So these are sponsors, managers, ambassadors. You want them to be allies in your process, and you really want to recruit them to get the message out to your first cohort. And finally, the support organization is a group that I've often seen overlooked. By the time you get to the support group, most planning feels complete, and you oftentimes feel like, well, I don't need to include those groups because they aren't necessarily going to be affected directly. This is a huge misstep. These are the critical teams that will support and could frankly sink your efforts if it doesn't go well for them. They, by word of mouth, can spread negative comments. They may not be on board in the early stages and feel left out, so they might delay your project. So it is absolutely important to remember to reach out to the support organization as well. And once you have all three teams identified, then you can craft a specific message that's a little bit different for the support organizations than it is for your workforce analysis. So I want to turn it back over to Peter to talk a little bit about the champions that are going to be part of these processes.
Thank you. This part is so important, and it is because when you look at who to engage around adoption, your first instinct is to go to leaders, business leaders, executives, leaders with title. Don't forget about other leaders or influencers in your environment. Champions will increase the impact of your message exponentially. I know because I was one. A year ago, I stood up in this large session with like 500 people and answered a question someone asked on how to work better with their customers. And I shared a way to do it in Teams. There weren't a lot of Teams users at that point. And after that event, a few people told me I should expect a lot of questions after I stood up. They were right. I probably did about 200 one-on-one sessions with people across SHI over the next 6 to 10 months. And I was just teaching them new workflows, things that I'd learned. They would teach me new things, and I would learn from them on things they discovered, which I would then share and teach to others. And the sharing of knowledge and information just spread through this one single person, me, out there in the environment, spreading the good word about how teams can help. I didn't really understand at the time that I was a champion until I went to an session at Ignite last year where they talked about how important these people are in your environment to successful adoption. And it was eye-opening. I was like, wow, I did that, and I didn't even realize it. So who are these people? They're the people who are most enthusiastic about new technology and ways of working. They're the people that send in all the tickets for the new stuff you launch, asking questions. They're known leaders, but not necessarily leaders with title. They're people who come to you with challenges and solutions when it comes to technology. And really, they're early adopters, and you know who early adopters are. Seek them out and bring them into your project. Now, none of this goes anywhere without quality training, and Rob's going to talk to you a little bit more about that now.
Thank you, Peter. So we've spoken about a lot here so far just in the past 22 minutes, and I think it's really important to recognize that when you talk about deployment, strategy, planning, adoption change management, ultimately the icing on the cake to truly drive adoption and make sure that your users are consuming Teams is to put together a comprehensive training plan that's going to be customizable and scalable. One of the mistakes that a lot of customers make in the beginning with specifically Teams is to just roll it out because they were told to, maybe because they're getting away from Skype or they just want to play with a new tool. But the reality is the training is really meant to align the projected outcomes that you're looking for with Teams to the actual users with the different tool sets that you have within Teams. So making sure that you're doing your part in that strategy and planning phase is really very important when you think about how we, again, align what is available in Teams and how can we enable our users to do more and be more productive. With that, we look at essentially 4 different steps within the program phase when you think about training. So first is the assessment when you consider the requirements for the project. What do the users need to know? What do the users need to do? Maybe you have different types of users and different types of use cases and roles within your organization, depending on the type of user we're talking about, depending on someone's digital competency, thinking about the department that they sit in. So making sure that we truly understand all of that and also taking into consideration different languages and locations that would ultimately help us craft the training accordingly. And we kind of move into that planning phase where we think about how we can design that program based on everything that we discovered in the assessment phase. And that's where we start talking about customizing content and making sure that it's not just a one-size-fits-all. It may not be just a Teams 101 training. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with different competencies and different job roles and skill sets, we need to make sure that your users have the right amount of training, but ultimately that the content is going to resonate with them to make sure that you see that level of consumption that you want Otherwise, you could potentially see your help desk call skyrocket, which nobody wants. At that point, once we get a good understanding of your users, we want to make sure that you have the right team of trainers and champions involved to make sure that you're driving the company message. This is not supposed to be a team's cheerleading session, as you would potentially do as part of your change management communication, but more about specific tool sets within teams. Once we put all of that together, we start piloting those sessions and really starting to think about when you launch the communication plan that John and Peter were talking about, so you can start to formally let your customers know, your end users know, what is coming down the pipe, what's in it for them, and what types of resources are going to be available to them, be it training, champion network, or different events throughout the organization to make sure that people understand, again, what's in it for them. And then lastly, with the additional empowerment, like VIP one-on-ones or desk side support, as well as e-learning. Offering your users different tools is going to make for a blended approach to your ultimate path to a successful deployment. So with that in mind, I think it's really important to think about the fact that you need to make sure that you can truly crawl before you can walk and walk before you can run. And I think that's really important when you consider the speed at which a particular user is going to move through a deployment. And what I mean by that is really thinking about the different types of training that's available, whether it's e-learning, live instructor-led training, and the different types of methodologies, I would say. And for some reason, this isn't popping up here the way I want it to. But essentially what we are trying to get at here is the fact that we want to, here we go, make sure that we're showing there's different ways of doing this. Everybody's different. We understand that, and we're sure you understand that. Training is one size fits all. IT projects are never one size fits all. So again, making sure that we can be lenient and make sure that we're giving a blended approach to essentially what would drive the highest impact. So when you think about how this all kind of pulls together, this is just a quick snapshot at really how all of these things work together. So up front in that first phase, we're making sure that we can train the IT admins that are supporting teams, making sure that they understand how to best support the platform and make sure that the security and governance of teams is also taken into consideration prior to rolling it out to the users. With that, we start to look at the phase two, which is really that first Teams training. So this is the first time that users are going to get their hands on Teams and play along with the trainer to make sure that, again, the tool sets that we originally envisioned for these users is going to be shown in some type of live instructor-led event, be it live on site at your facility or potentially live online. I'm sure you can imagine with COVID-19, we have been inundated with live online events, which are just as effective. As we move into the third phase, we really start talking about additional end user training with e-learning. Specifically, this e-learning is meant to be a supplement or an augmented tool for people to go to after live instructor-led training so they can very quickly look and find what they're trying to navigate or what they're trying to use within Teams without having to sit through a recorded session or Google or YouTube, right? We want to bring them right into that new portal, and we can do that directly inside of Teams with functionality that we just launched just a few weeks ago. So again, giving users the ability to learn their own way. And then lastly, the empowerment, like I talked about, and making sure that we are staying on top of the VIPs that need the additional training or any other applications that you're going to start integrating into Teams, like Excel, like OneDrive, like OneNote. So again, we want to be mindful of the user experience and how we can drive people from a Teams 101 perspective all the way to essentially building their own Teams toolkit. So with that, I just wanted to kind of ask the audience here, when you think about these types of projects in the past, what would you say have been the most effective methods for training? Now, not specific to Teams, maybe to an old version of Office when you went from Office 2003 to 2007 years ago, or anything beyond that. We're pretty curious to understand what that looks like, because we do see a lot of organizations that are still looking for traditional live instructor-led training, but at the same time, we do see a pretty even response here, especially with, the way that we work today. E-learning tends to be big as well. So let's go ahead and take a look here. And it's pretty much what I thought it would be, an even spread across live instructor-led training and e-learning. So I'm glad to see that everybody is already kind of up to par and on the same page with really what's going to yield the best response from your users, again, to make sure that everything we're talking about here is going to resonate. And as we kind of wean down here, I think it's really important to think about what is going to make, excuse me, let me just go back here. What is going to be the best case scenario when you think about all that we talked about here? And when you think about what Mike spoke about and what Peter and John spoke about, we really want you to have some takeaways here, right? So thinking about a 5-step action plan. Number 1, make sure that you are interviewing your stakeholders and understand how Teams is going to impact the organization. That is so important, because if you don't do that, you really can't define a strategy to make sure that you're leveraging Teams the way that your stakeholders really want Teams to be leveraged, right? And once you have that strategy, how do we measure our success? So putting some critical success factors and measurable outcomes out there, whether it's looking at your overall consumption through various reports, polling your users, or just feedback that you potentially get from your help desk and your IT staff, as well as from your champion network. Identifying a champion network and adoption change management strategy is key to this entire integrated solution, as Peter and John spoke about. It's absolutely vital to make sure that we go from planning, strategy, and deployment to training with a cohesive in-between of that adoption change management piece around communications and making sure that your users understand, again, what's in it for them. And then lastly, making sure that you're assessing the knowledge gaps and implementing a training program, as I just talked about. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So think about the different modalities and methodologies that are out there to make sure that we can understand your organization, that you understand the needs of your users, as well as the tool sets that are available. Ultimately, that is going to drive a new way of working and how things will be handled moving forward when you think about chat, meet, call, and collaborate. So with all of those things, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to share a quick success story, how we've put all of these things together for a recent customer.
Thank you, Rob. So at this point, you're all probably thinking, that sounds good in theory. Your methodology seems to make sense, but I really just don't have the time to go through all those steps that you guys have discussed today. So I'm going to try to convince you otherwise with the customer that we recently helped deploy Microsoft Teams. But before I do that, I want to remind you that if you do have any questions, please go to the Q&A panel in your window there and submit your questions. We will get to those right after the next 2 slides here. So make sure you do that. We've got a couple of questions that have already come in and look forward to hearing more. So anyway, customer of ours came to us beginning of March and said, SHI, Microsoft, guess what? We are in the process of deploying a new electronic health record system for our organization. But because of COVID-19, we now have 600 workers, project members that are both team members as well as high-paid consultants that are now working remotely. And they need a way to communicate with one another and collaborate with one another to make sure we're successful with this engagement they're trying to do. And we can't really slow down that process. Oh, and by the way, we need to be concerned about the types of data that are being stored in this environment because we have patient healthcare data that could be stored here, and we got to make sure that that's protected for us. The good news was that they already had a Microsoft Teams tenant in place. The bad news was that both from an end user perspective as well as a system administrator perspective, they were really not comfortable with that Microsoft Teams environment yet. So they needed some training on that. And then to make matters worse, they also told us that we have 2 weeks to implement the solution, make sure everybody's trained and ready to go so as to not hold up the project any further. Well, we put our heads together and came up with a plan to do that, just that, including all of the steps that we've talked to you about here today. We came up with a strategy at the beginning that included an adoption and change management program. It also included a training plan for those end users as well as the system administrators. And then it also included us actually helping set up and spin up that Microsoft Teams environment and integrate it with their existing environment from an email standpoint so they could get their email calendars synced between the new cloud environment within Microsoft Teams and what they were doing on premise. So we're able to do that all within the 2 the 2 weeks that they'd asked us to do, which was actually pretty amazing. Even from our standpoint, we were kind of shocked that we were able to get that done that quickly. But it just goes to show that with the right methodology in place, the right people working on it, you can actually do that. Customers are so happy with the results of this that they've now come back to both the Microsoft team and the SHI team asking for us to help them deploy the same solution to the rest of their organization. So they're actually going from reluctant adopters of the Microsoft Teams technology due to concerns with privacy of data to fully embracing that technology going forward. So if that wasn't enough to convince you, I'd also like to make one more offer for you. We would like to set up a call with a couple of folks on your team to really talk about what your current team strategy is and where you are today and how we would suggest you move forward to make sure you get through to successfully implementing Teams. So if you would reach out to your account executive from SHI and ask them for this assessment, or you can even use the Q&A panel here to request that we work with you on that. We'd be more than happy to work with you. As you can imagine, we can't do a million of these. So what we've said is for the first 25 people who take us up on this offer, we'd be happy to get on that phone call with you to discuss where you're at today and where we would recommend you go next with that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. And it looks like we've got the first couple questions coming in. Okay, first question. I'll go ahead and take this one. Can Teams do webinars, or is it for small team meetings? You're absolutely right. It can do webinars. There's a solution within Microsoft Teams called Live Events. Live Events allows you to have up to 10,000 people join an event, similar to what you're seeing here with On24, that you can therefore schedule an event and have a lot of people join that event for you. So it's not just for small team meetings. You can actually use this for live events. Okay, next question. Okay, what would be the expected duration of a Teams rollout for an organization with about 2,000 users from initial planning to completion of training? I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll turn it over to Peter and John if you want to add your thoughts on it as well. So typically what we've seen for organizations of that size, if we have the necessary time to do it right. The COVID-19 situation that I was just talking about there was an exceptional situation. We had to rush a lot of things and put a lot of resources on it. If you're trying to do it at a more leisurely pace, I would suggest that you're probably talking about a month or so, month and a half or so, to go from the initial planning of it to actually deploying that solution. Of course, that has the caveats of that you've got an engaged team that's supporting you while you do that, and you've got end users that are providing you the input on a timely basis. But we've typically seen we've been able to roll out a Teams solution to some extent within a month period. I don't know, Peter, John, you want to add to that?
I mean, the phone piece is always a variable, right?
True.
People can significant complexity in their phone system. Porting 2,000 numbers is not a small task in time. So I would say that you really want to take the phone piece of it and take a deeper look at specifically that and understand the time for just that piece, and then build that into the larger plan when that particular piece makes the most sense, because that chunk can be, for 2,000 people, a lot of work on the back end. It can also be very simple. It comes down to your level of complexity in your current phone system.
Sure. So while we're on the subject of the phone capabilities of Teams, is Teams Phone available globally, or is that just something that's US-based?
That's a great question. So one, always changing. Microsoft is moving rapidly with Teams, so they're adding more and more countries as time goes on. There's quite a few ways to get PSTN connectivity into Teams. I believe Microsoft has it in around 15 countries right now. Please don't quote me. It could be more. Like I said, this changes real quick. And then Microsoft has licensed a series of global carriers who are certified partners who can carry you through to another 20, 30 potential countries. And those carriers also offer hosted support plans around session border controllers and call plans in some of the more difficult places in the world where you might have to set up infrastructure with another solution. The carrier has already done it for you and can help you traverse into those areas. But it is available globally. It just depends on which carrier you work with.
Great. Thanks, Pete. So on the thought process of deploying globally, a question came in around just that, of what are the challenges that an organization, or that we've seen when working with an organization when it comes to a global deployment. I'm going to start with Peter, then I'm going to go with Rob next on that.
I'm going to go right to Rob, because I answered that question. When it comes to my space, which is, the collaboration and the phone, it's the exact answer to the last question. It's finding the right connectivity, the right carrier, and the carrier that has the services you need. That's pretty much it.
Okay. Great. Rob, from your perspective, I'm sure languages come into play and other things when you're dealing with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we definitely take into consideration language, time zone, depending on where a trainer would be presenting or facilitating a session from. But the other major thing to keep in mind is when we deal with global organizations, we tend to find that culture could be very different between potentially their U.S. offices in APAC, Europe, LATAM. So it's not as simple sometimes as just trying to figure out what content do you need and who do we need to deliver it to. It's really making sure that we dive a little bit deeper to understand what is the typical way that these users are used to working and how are they going to leverage the technology. So other than time zone, language, and just travel in general, I would say that just being mindful of culture is highly important. And that's really where I would say is one of the main things that I would not say has been a challenge for us, but definitely something to be mindful of for anyone that's planning this type of project.
Great. Thanks, Rob. So on a similar note, when you're talking about the cultures around the world, how would you see, Rob, driving a consistent experience for our users when they're deploying Microsoft Teams?
That's a great question. So when we get back to thinking about the original vision for Teams, it's highly important that through communications and through executive sponsorship, as well as the champion networks, that we're using those channels as means of letting all of the users know, hey, this is our intent for Teams. They may be as simple as just simple chat and video call, but it may be a little more convoluted than that, depending on what tools you're replacing. So for starters, making sure that the entire organization understands what's new, what's coming down the pipe, what's in it for them, and then making sure that there's a standard around what tool sets are going to be leveraged. Then we would build the content accordingly to make sure that whether you're an employee in New York, San Francisco, London, Singapore, wherever you are getting the same message from, up above, but also we are being mindful of, again, the culture and the way that you work. So we're really customizing the content. So again, the content has two parts of it: this standard core curriculum to drive a consistent message, but also potentially customized to fit the specific need of your group, department, country, or culture.
Great, thanks, Rob. Okay, I'm going to take this next one. The question was, we have both OneDrive for Business and Microsoft Teams on the roadmap, for an enterprise rollout. Which would you attack first? Any caveats to trying to deliver in parallel? So the good news is that OneDrive is actually one of the background components that enables Microsoft Teams. So you're really going to implement them together. It's just Teams puts a front end onto that OneDrive deployment that gives you another way of accessing those files that you may put in OneDrive. You can still access them the normal OneDrive method of doing so through Internet Explorer, through the File Explorer, but you can also now do it through Teams itself. There's capabilities within that. So Teams can become kind of your central hub for a lot of things that your end users are going to want to do as an organization. So great question. You're going to kind of do it jointly. You may choose to notify the end users that OneDrive is there and available and allow them to use it on its own, or you may choose to just make it kind of in the background and have it just part of the Teams deployment, but definitely no issues with doing that. Okay, now back to one for you, Peter. Let's see. Sorry, it just moved on me. Where did it go? Okay, there it is. Can the phone system distribute phone calls in a call center like a Mitel system could?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some basic functionality for routing and hunt groups and things of that nature built into Microsoft. And then there's a variety of, again, Microsoft certified contact center partners. We work with all of them, and we have this conversation all the time, actually. And you can bring in one of those partners for advanced functionality and integrate directly into Teams.
Great, thanks, Peter. Okay, so a number of other questions have come in. Running up to the end of time, so I only have time to answer one more question. We will answer those other questions for you. We have your contact information here, so we will get back to you with those additional answers that you're looking for. So the next question I have is, would Microsoft Teams be good for managing projects? And I would argue, yes, most definitely. It has a number of different capabilities. There's plugins for Microsoft Project that you can get to from Teams environment itself. You can also use, and we use it all the time, to collaborate with one another and store documents and co-author documents within that Teams environment. So there's a lot of capabilities built in, including kind of a light version of Microsoft Project that's available in there. Not necessarily something that a professional project manager is going to want to use, but it's definitely something that a team could use as they try to manage tasks that they're working on for a project. So with that, if you do have additional questions, please go ahead and submit them. You can keep submitting them. We will get to those. We promise we get to those. We do value your questions. We appreciate you guys taking time with us today. There's a lot of great sessions going on the rest of today and the rest of the week. I would encourage you to please explore those other sessions that are out there. And one final request, I would ask you to fill out the survey so we know how we did and how we can improve on these sessions in the future. With that, have a wonderful day and enjoy your rest of your time at the SHI Customer Summit.
Thanks, everybody.